Hello, welcome back. My name is Ari, and today I'm gonna go over some series that I'm just never gonna finish. Like, they're series that I've read the first book or maybe like multiple books in, and for one reason or another, I'm not gonna finish them. I have no interest. Actually, what we're gonna do is if I talk about a series that you think I should finish, throw it down in the comments about why I should finish it. Like, maybe I read the first book and didn't like it, but the rest of the series is utterly fantastic and I'm entirely missing out. Like, I am not opposed to reading any of these books other than lack of interest. So throw that down in the comments below. Now, this is not going to be all inclusive. I am sure there are many series that I have started years and years and years and years ago that I either didn't know their series, I completely forgot that I've read them, but I'm not going to continue them for one reason or another, and I'm just not going to talk about this. I think almost everything on this list are books that I have read in the past 2-3 years from series that I'm not going to continue. So there you go. Let's start with the Ender's Saga from Orson Scott Card. So a lot of you have heard of Ender's Game, I assume. This is a science fiction book, a fairly problematic science fiction book about a very, very young child who is basically tricked into murdering an entire race of aliens. That was probably spoilery, I'm sorry. But that's really what this is about, even though that's not how anybody would probably describe it. I read the first 2 books of this series, and the first book I thought was like interesting before processing that it was very problematic, and the second book was just downright boring. So why would I continue on? The next series is The Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer. This is the, like, they're fairy tale retellings, I guess. And the first one is Cinder, and it's about Cinderella, but she's an android, or part android. She's got mechanical bits, which I can't remember if it was like completely illegal or just, I don't think it's illegal. I think it's just extremely like frowned upon. Like, you're less than human if you're not fully human. And obviously a Cinderella story in there. I just thought this was mediocre. And there was nothing about the end of book 1 that made me excited to read into book 2. I also thought like each individual book would take place in the same universe but be about a completely different like Disney princess. But you never even like completed Cinder's tale from the first book. Apparently like her story is like overarching across like multiple books, and I wasn't interested enough to continue. Next series is Camelot Rising by Kirsten White. I got an arc and read the Guinevere deception November of 2019, I think. And I thought it was, again, extremely mediocre. There was nothing about the first book that made me want to continue on the series. It was obviously a King Arthur retelling, but from Guinevere's perspective, but like, it wasn't interesting. Her perspective like sucked. Like, the one thing, it's obviously been a minute since I've read this, but the thing that I remember most is Guinevere kept saying that she would do anything for Arthur. She would die for Arthur and blah, 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 blah. But there was nothing shown in the book that gave any reason that she would have done any of this stuff. It's like, okay, you say this, but why? The only thing that I even vaguely remember interesting about this book that would even like kind of make me want to contemplate reading on was that Lancelot is a female in this series. But then I've heard other booktubers that I mostly trust their opinions on books saying that the second book was just awful. So I don't think we're going there. Next up is the Dune series by Frank Herbert. I loved Dune, but I don't know. I'm not motivated to talk about the rest of the series, because every time you hear people talk about Dune, you hear people talk about Dune, like just that first book, like it's a standalone. And I've never really heard anybody pitch continuing on with the series, so I'm not going to continue on with the series. One that you could probably pretty easily talk me into is The Diviners by Libba Bray. I did read the first book in the series, and again, it was just mediocre. Like, the main character and her overuse of 1920s slang, or it might not have even been real slang, but it was just kind of annoying. And I don't have a huge interest in it except for the love story. Like, the love story kind of makes me want to read on, because I want to know who gets with whom. But then again, I don't really care. Next up is, this one is one that I've read a lot of books in, and that is the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series by Laurel K. Hamilton. There are 28 books in this series, and I have read 20 of them. But it just got to a point where I stopped caring when they came out, and I just didn't pick something up and then continue not to pick that up. I can say the same thing about Janet Ivanovich's, like, Stephanie, I can't remember her last name, but the 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get deadly, it's all like numbers like that. There was just came a point where I just stopped picking the books up and just kind of lost interest in the story. So next was the Girls of Paper and Fire series by Natasha Nian? I can't say her last name. Anyway, I loved the first book in Girls of Paper and Fire. It was a beautiful sapphic romance that I enjoyed. And then the second book the second book basically, like, overdid it with the LGBTQIA thing, where, like, I love LGBTQIA characters, but every single relationship in this book was basically, if it wasn't LGBTQIA, it was abusive or like an arranged marriage. And it's like no one's parents were actually happy with each other, that they loved other people, and it's just like, come on, like, don't bash cis relationships and, like, go out of your way to say every cis relationship is horrible to promote, like, LGBTQIA. Like, love should be however you want it. Like, you shouldn't have to force me to be sapphic if I don't want to be, exactly like I shouldn't have to force somebody to be cis if they don't want to be. It goes both ways, and it was just, it felt bad, and then it was just so, like, everybody had to be in a relationship. Like, there was no plot to this story other than relationships. Next up is Small Spaces by Catherine Arden, and Catherine Arden wrote the Bear and the Nightingale series, which was my favorite book series of 2019. Like multiple books in there were my favorite of 2019 books. And I read Small Spaces because I think it's the only other thing that she's written, but it's a middle grade. And it's like a middle grade horror. And I don't do well with middle grades. They're too sweet. So a horror that's like gushy and sweet just didn't do it for me. So we're gonna skip the rest of that series. Next up was the Singing Hills cycle by Ni Vo. Words are so hard. This was, or one of the first book in this series, which was the Empress of Salt and Sorrow, I think, was nominated for Goodreads Choice, and that's why I read it. I don't like this style of storytelling where somebody is like cleaning house and they find an object, and that object is like the perfect object for the next section of a longer story they're telling. Like for some reason, like these objects have been lost for 30, 40, 50 years, and as they're cleaning something out for like a funeral or whatever reason they're cleaning, like this, not necessarily like this specific book, but like overall in this kind of storytelling, it's just they happen to find these objects that have been lost for such a long time in the exact order that it takes to tell this story. And I just personally don't like storytelling like that. I don't like conveniences where something is so convenient just for the story. It feels like lazy writing to me, even though I know in this case it's not, that's just that type of storytelling. I just don't particularly like it, so I have no desire to continue in the series because of that. Next is the Islands of Blood and Shadow. No, the Islands of Blood and Storm series by Kaysen Callender. I didn't like the first book in this series at all. I felt like what we were seeing of the characters on page and what we were being told about the characters were completely different things, and that nothing as far as like plot lines made sense because of that. Like you're told one thing and you see something completely different. So if I didn't like book one, I have literally no desire at all to continue with book two. Next is the Eldest Curses series by Cassandra Clare, and oh god, what is that other author's name? This series, Wesley Chu. So it's a Shadowhunters novel, but it's like a side plot where you're following Magnus and Alec during the like time frame of like the actual original Shadowhunters series, but like in a completely like side plot that you didn't see in the Shadowhunter series. I don't personally care about Alec and Magnus as a couple, so I think this is mostly I don't want to continue because I don't give a shit about the characters. I like Magnus as a character, and I like Alec as a character okay, because I never really loved the characters from the first Shadowhunter trilogy to begin with. That's like not even close to my favorite Shadowhunter trilogy. But I don't necessarily, like, I feel like they're better side characters than they are main characters, I guess is the most appropriate way to put that. So not gonna finish this out probably. Next up is the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. If you've been watching my videos for a little while, you'll know that I don't really like that private eye type of story, like main character. It always feels misogynistic to me, even if it's not necessarily like blatantly misogynistic. And book one of this felt like blatantly misogynistic. It was like, this guy is the savior of women. Some woman comes to him because her husband's acting weird and she needs him to save her. And there's multiple women that he comes across in this book and he saves every single one of them. And I don't care for that trope. So I don't really have any desire to continue on with the Dresden Files. So, and like, again, I don't think Jim Butcher's like intentionally being misogynistic. Like, I'm sure there are powerful women in this, or it's not about necessarily women at all. It's just the protagonist happens to be male, and so the protagonist is going to be a savior. I just think that the private eye trope specifically always reads as misogynistic to me personally, if that makes sense. I feel like I'm gonna piss people off who love the Dresden Files, and that is not my goal. I'm just telling you that I don't have any desire to continue reading it. Next is the Ink and Sigil series by Kevin Hearn. I thought the first book in this series was just like a hot, steaming mess. Like your dog pooped on the floor and you can just see the steam rising off of it. It was just like all over the place. There was no consistency. Like the perspectives changed for absolutely no reason. You would get flashbacks for absolutely no reason. Like the whole thing was just a train wreck. And yeah, I didn't actually hate the book. I just thought like the pacing of the book and the way the story was told was so awful that I have no desire to continue with the series. Next is The Great Cities by N.K. Jemisin, which the first book in the series was The City We Became. I just didn't like this. I felt the characters were very flat. I didn't like the characters' motivations, or like the bad guys' motivations. Like it didn't make any sense to me, and I'm not like a huge fan of New York. So maybe if this, I think the second book in the series is going to stay in New York. Like the way that wrapped up, it doesn't make sense to do another city for the Great Cities, but I could be wrong. So if the second book is a Great Cities book of a completely different city other than New York, then I will probably try it. I just don't continue to carry on with the New York story, if that makes any sense at all. Next up is Legend by Marie Lu. I hated Day as a character. So that's it. That's the only reason that I don't want to continue with that series, is I like hate Day as a character. The end. Next. Next is probably gonna piss people off, and that is the First Law trilogy. No one still has explained to me why people like this series. And I love grimdark. So I know everybody was like, oh, you won't like this if you don't like grimdark. I love grimdark. But there was nothing grimdark about the first book, or nothing like overtly dark. There was like darkness, but nothing that would be like, oh my god, this is grimdark. It was just like, yeah, these characters are a bunch of assholes, and this was an entirely a character-driven narrative for at least the first book. There was no plot. And you want me to continue on in a series, and you're telling me one of the greatest series of all times is a book, or based off of a book where I have no desire, I have no feelings at all towards any of the characters. Like, because I can understand, like, if I hated the characters, like, wanting to continue on and, like, live through their misery in a grim, dark setting, or if I love the characters, wanting to continue on and, like, seeing how they morph as characters. But I just felt like nothing about any of the characters at all. I felt a lot of them were stupid, but I don't think that's the emotion that I need. And then there was no plot. So I don't care what happens to any of these people. Why is this so good? Please, please somebody tell me. Next up is Anna K by Jenny Lee. I hated this. This is like one of those YA contemporary books where, like, absentee parents type thing, which is a huge trope in YA. It's like all of these kids do something like this because their parents, like, don't exist. And I hate reading about people being bad parents. And it was just like, that's all this was. Is like, it's a bunch of like 14, 15, 16-year-olds drinking, doing drugs, and having sex with each other. And why, as a 36-year-old woman, would I ever want to read about rich, shitty teenagers with absentee parents doing shit that no adult should do, much less that children should do? So yeah, I have like no, far, far no interest in the rest of this story. Next is Ice Planet Barbarians by Ruby Dixon, and I hear about this all over BookTube. It's like, oh, this is such a great, like, fun, smutty fantasy thing, but it was just, it felt rapey to me. Honestly, like, I can get past, like, a problematic, like, questionable consent if there's, like, a really good plot to back it up. Where it's like, yes, that was one situation in the book where one or two, I think there was two situations of questionable consent in this book. And I could get behind that and deal with it in a story if the rest of the story is good. But to me, the rest of the story was just overshadowed by the questionable consent. And I guess that's it. Like, I didn't like the universe and the setup for this series enough to continue with the series. Apologies if the camera angle changed a little bit. My memory card got full and I jostled the camera a lot trying to get the damn thing out to change it. Hostage of Empire by S.C. Emmett. The first book in the series is called The Throne of the Five Winds, and I, like, legitimately have no recollection at all of reading this book. So I'm guessing that I'm not going to continue on with this series because the first book didn't stand out in any sort of way that is meaningful to continue the series. But like, even my review of it is like literally the most generic review that tells me absolutely nothing of what this book is about. It was like, there were two brothers who loved this, who had a love triangle with a woman, and it was a character-driven narrative. It's literally, my review is, this is one of those books people will either love or hate depending on their reading preferences. It's a very character-driven narrative, not a plot-driven story, so if you don't like the characters, there's nothing to keep you invested in the book. The world is based on Asian cultures in a fantasy setting. If you like stories based on Asian cultures, you'll probably like this. I like the book, but I wanted more. There's a hint of a love triangle where two brothers seem to be in love with the same woman, but nothing really ever comes of that. I wanted more of a plot. And then I'd probably read the next book, but apparently not, because I don't remember this at all. That's the first time in a long time where I like can't remember, like I'll say like, oh, I don't really remember that book, but I can't like refresh myself on the plot by like reading a synopsis. So that was hard mediocre. And then the last series, at least on this list, that I am not reading, I think will shock everybody. And that's because it's a series by Brandon Sanderson. This is Brandon Sanderson's middle grade series called Alcatraz and the Evil Librarians. And this is from Alcatraz versus the Evil Librarians. And this is from the perspective of a young boy named Alcatraz. And he was raised in the human world and finds out that he's actually part of a magical world that exists in parallel to our world. But all librarians are evil, and they're trying to control the non-magical human population by not letting them know that there's a magical world, and then like destroy the magical population. Very convoluted. This is told like in like first person narrative format from Alcatraz, and he is not a reliable narrator, but he also says like, if you're reading this in the human world, then you're gonna think that this is fantasy, but this really happened and the librarians are just trying to hide it from you. Mostly it's young. I want to say it's stupid, which it is kind of stupid, but stupid in a way that would appeal to a younger audience and just not adult me. So I magically actually don't like a Brandon Sanderson series. I've read the first 3 books in this series, I think. But yeah, honestly, I'll probably end up reading these just because I'm a completionist and need to read every single book Brandon Sanderson's ever written. I'm just going to tell you I don't like this one. Like, at all. So, those are series that I don't want to read. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Should I read any of these? Am I missing out by stopping where I stopped? Are there series that you have like completely given up on and you want to talk about here? Let me know also down in the comments. Now there are a billion other series that I could say are books that or series that I want to read. So if you want to see a video on series that I've started and do want to complete, or I plan on completing, let me know that too down in the comments, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye.